Hello and welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Cobb, and this is my co-host,
Thomas Pope.
Today, we're here to talk about some interesting things some questions.
Questions and claims.
Questions and claims.
So, specifically, claims that are made against Christians and Christianity, and also some questions for Christians as to kind of what should our response be and the like.
Yeah.
Basically.
And this is kind of like inspired from, the first question that we kind of inspired this all to come up with this topic was like the question of how Christians should treat or deal with or think about like things like homosexuality and stuff like that. And if you go on YouTube, you'll find a bunch of comments about how Christians, if God tells us to be loving, then how come Christians don't hate homosexuals? And there's all sorts of arguments about that. It's just a very loaded topic.
Very much.
And between Christians, there's many different views on this, and between non-Christians, there's many different views on this, and many different views on how Christians should think of us between non-Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just a very fun topic to get into because it's a lot of different views about the same thing. And it seems like it's the one thing that non-Christians actually care what Christians think about. But
yeah, one of the few.
Yeah. and so then I thought that would be a fun thing to talk about. Then we just came up with a bunch of other things that are along the same line.
So start us off with I guess your initial idea.
Yeah.
What was the claim or question?
Well, let's see if I can phrase this as a question towards you. Actually, I can express my theory on this first, then you can make a comment if that works.
Sure.
So, basically, from what I understand in the Bible, homosexuality is wrong, right? Or like gay marriage. Here's a verse about this. Let's see. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But there's
several verses.
There's several verses, but there's one verse about how gay marriage, or men lusting after other men and women lusting after other women I
want to say that's in either 1st or 2nd Corinthians.
Is a sign of, or people are chasing after their own sinful natures, and then they fall into confusion or something like that. I need to find the verse. Actually, it's kind of important for this
moment while we do some quick Bible drills.
Okay, so it's actually not in Corinthians, it's actually in Romans. Anyway, Romans 1:26. Because of this, God gave them over to their shameful lusts. Even the woman exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with one another and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. And we should bring back to verse 24 to give context. Therefore, God gave them over in sinful desires of their hearts, the sexual impurity, for degrading their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped the served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. So basically, what I get out of this verse is not only does God not like it, and in another place it mentions that those who practice such things will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Not only that, but God sees it as unnatural.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like He's letting us do this. He's letting us do this as a punishment for turning away from Him. So that's just a different way that's the way I see it, is it's not like, because we as a culture turned away from God, He's letting these things influence our. He's letting these things influence our culture, which are basically like a cancer.
It's one way to look at it.
That's how I see it. It's like it's like a mental confusion that we as a culture are in, and it's not natural at all. It's unnatural, but and because of sin that's happened, God has allowed us to fall into such things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not using that verse. I'd say that homosexuality is not like we're not born that way. It's not.
I actually read something that this somebody was saying that this passage, they were trying to take an honest look at it, and they were saying this passage, it's actually what it's saying is that it's referring to straight men who go against their own nature and behave like homosexuals, essentially, which that involved adding some words and things. But
yeah.
uh,
Yeah. And so that's my view on this topic. But should we as Christians, why is it that we as Christians are so bombarded for this view when we're not as bombarded for other views, per se? Like, we're not, Christians aren't as attacked for their views on, let's say, maybe premarital sex or something like that.
not as much.
Not as much. Or maybe murder. As much.
Well, that's because most people believe murder is wrong.
Not most people.
Well, a lot of people.
Like less than 50% of the population of this country.
What?
Abortion.
Oh, okay. So when you're talking about that, that's different. They just don't define it as murder.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you're right. That is a little bit different because they don't define it as murder. At least some people. Well, it's a gray area. But anyway, it's a lot of like confusing stuff to get into.
Okay, so what's the question you're asking me?
So the question is like, why do you think we're attacked more in this and some other things?
So, and that's a difficult question to answer. Because in order to fully answer it, you have to know everyone's motives for why they do something, and we don't know that. But I guess if I were to hazard a guess, it's partially just because that's the entire direction of our culture is kind of going towards this way. And if we stand against it, then that's very much going against the general more accepting, open, morally ambiguous and relativist culture that we're kind of sinking into. That wants to say like, oh, you can do whatever you want. Whatever is right for you is what's right. Just believe what you want to believe. So the culture is all saying going this kind of direction. And in this case, if we as Christians take a stand for what the Bible says, we are going against that and saying, well, actually not. People who believe a certain way are wrong.
Yeah.
Which maybe more so than with some other Christian beliefs. For this one particularly for homosexuality, because it's more singling out what people see as like a group of people, you know.
It kind of how I see it is that I think Christians are more aggressive on this front than they are on some other fronts. And
that's also a good possibility. And
I think there's a reason for that. I think the reason for that is not necessarily because I don't think we're equally aggressive on all fronts. Like, we're not equally aggressive on like some other sins that people in the world are committing as we are with this. And I think the reason for that is because this goes not only against our biblical values, it also goes against our traditional values.
Yeah. Which
And some other,
sad to say, which of those is strongest for some Christians or people who describe themselves as Christians is
so
maybe
it,
their tradition is stronger, and so you start.
so like another sin that's not necessarily against our traditional values, or we don't. It's been around since we were. A lot of the people that get yelled at the most for their view on this is typically people of older generations,
Mm.
and maybe sins that were around when they were a kid. They've just been gotten used to, so they're not yelling as loudly about, or they're not as loud about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to some degree. So like, well, for instance, like sanctity of marriage, like marriage and divorce, or premarital sex. Those have kind of been. I mean, those are taught against in the Bible, but largely they've kind of been dropped as issues for most Christians in most churches, which is.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of counterintuitive. Like they've kind of become social norms even within the church. And so we don't really, a Christian wouldn't normally be as aggressive on that.
Yeah.
And then, but this, however,
is new.
It's largely new. Within the past 10 or 20 years is really when homosexuality has really been on the rise in America, at least.
And publicly.
Publicly. Yeah, I get it's been around, but it's on the rise publicly, and more people are coming out. So yeah, it's something new. It's something people are uncomfortable with. So I think a lot of the reaction that Christians are having to it is not necessarily, oh, the Bible says it's wrong. It's more, oh, I find this wrong. This is against my own values, or I'm uncomfortable with this new thing, because people are uncomfortable with new things.
Yeah, and then they find then the Bible backs them up.
And then they're like, oh, see, look, the Bible says you can't do this, therefore don't do this.
Yeah.
And it's a really sad kind of situation, because you have people arguing a point, but it kind of loses a lot of its power because they're arguing the point for the wrong reasons. And also they've already dropped the ball on so many similar issues and other issues that it's like, well, you can't say marriage is between one man and one woman because you've dropped the ball on marriage and divorce and on premarital sex a long time ago. Like,
yeah,
you've been married like sometimes, they're preachers and members in churches. They've been married multiple times, and that's perfectly okay, even though the Bible speaks out against that.
And so we need to change our perspective on this as a church, because the way I see it, a sin is a sin. Yeah, just because like homosexuality is a newer sin than divorce doesn't mean it's necessarily any worse, because I think God sees it's not like, as we know through scriptures, it's not like a level of sin. It's
the Bible doesn't really say like, this is a really bad sin. It doesn't really give much of a grade or like a weight to sins. It's just a sin, right?
Well, it's like, if you sin from God and do not repent, you've missed the mark.
Mm-hmm.
You've turned away from Him. And so that sin could be super, super tiny. If you've made a super tiny sin and you never repented for it, and you think and you justify it in your own eyes, you're denying God.
Yeah.
And so a sin is a sin in that regard.
Right.
Because, yeah, I mean, some sins may have more of effect than others on this earth. But as far as like, if you're turning away from God and you're not, and you're choosing to choose your own opinion over God's word for this one thing, no matter how big or small it is, you're turning away from God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that on one side of the issue is we need to start seeing a sin as a sin.
Right.
And not doing it, and having levels of sin could lead to hypocrisy.
And while a lot of people probably wouldn't say that they think one sin is worse than another, they treat it like that for certain things.
Yeah.
So like especially for things that are newer and that they find more appalling, so like homosexuality or abortion, they treat those as above and beyond, as worse than other things, which I think is not right for sure, because then we put a really heavy weight on just a couple issues, and then Christians start being called, hypocrites. Intolerant and bigoted and hypocrites, which is some stuff we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really sad, and especially because a lot of the arguments we use we're kind of being hypocritical about, especially with like homosexuality, because we've already lost, or not really lost, we've conceded several other similar battles, right?
Yeah.
Like
We've given up, or we've kind of ignored them.
Right, we've ignored. So at the core of it, I guess the debate for homosexuality isn't just about the limited number of verses that specifically address it. It's at its core, it's what is God's view and model for love and for
marriage
and for sexual union. What is his model for that? And when you get into that, then you see that this issue is closely tied in with marriage, with fornication and adultery. All of this is really
all the same.
All the sins that are related to it, all forms of immorality, so to speak, are really kind of, in a way, the same sin. They're going against God's model for it.
Yeah. So, like, premarital sex could, I don't know, it's in the same category as homosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And one we have put up a strong oppression to, or aggression against, and then one we've kind of ignored it.
Most people would say it's maybe wrong, and probably and a lot of Christians maybe don't do it, but we've kind of grown silent on it.
Yeah. And so I think we need to be careful not to start leveling sins, unless for one reason is because it can make us seem hypocritical.
Mm-hmm.
And for the other reason is it can start to it can put a barrier between us and the world. Because if we were to be equally aggressive toward every sin as we were toward homosexuality, then we would probably not go outside our walls. We would lock ourselves away because of all the sin was out in the world.
Or we'd be hated by everyone, and not necessarily for a good reason, you know.
Yeah.
Because we were just judgmental and pointing fingers at everyone, and that's not completely the model for how we should treat other people.
Yeah, and well, so it comes down to this: is like we need to rethink how we view sin outside of the church.
Right.
Because we have grasped this with lots of sins. With almost every sin, we've kind of like, okay, if they're not a Christian, then what does it matter if they do this sin? But it's like, but when we come to homosexuality, it's like, it doesn't matter if they're a Christian. They can't do that.
A little bit, yeah.
And it's like, wait, what? Why do we think it like that? Because
on so many levels we're like, we don't care if they do certain things, but if they do these other certain things, then, oh, you can't, like, we get all up in arms, and that's two-sided. That's not how it should be. So yeah, I guess a lot of this ties into what should our attitudes be towards other people? So let me ask you the question. What should our attitude toward people living in homosexuality be? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, for somebody outside of the church, and let me clarify, the majority of this is like we're talking about people outside the church, and it's completely, all these questions are completely different if we're talking about somebody inside the church.
Mm-hmm.
Let's clarify that first. But like for somebody outside the church, I mean, it's a sin, but everybody sins.
So how would you treat someone? How should we treat someone who is outside of the church and is a homosexual?
I mean, theoretically, ideally, we should treat them like we would anybody else outside the church.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we should work towards. So, I think.
So if I can give my answer is yeah, we treat them pretty much the same as we do treat them the same as everyone else. We don't see that as a major differentiating factor, because when you get back down to the very core of it, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Mm-hmm. And if we think of all sins as being equal, we really can't treat any one group as morally like inferior because of a certain sin, because we've all sinned. I'm a sinner. you're a sinner. We still have our own sins, and so if we're going to treat people really poorly for one predominant sin in their life, then, well, what about us? So, and I would say, and this really just goes with how to act with anyone outside the church, any non-Christians, is you just show love to them.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, you don't get all up in arms. You don't refuse to associate with them, or refuse to talk with them because of their beliefs.
Yeah.
That's not how. I mean, if you think about it, Jesus spent a lot of his time with sinners who he probably didn't agree with on a lot of things, but that's not.
And like the story of, and Jesus was spent time with, well, a little bit like with prostitutes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was like an uncomfortable thing for like his disciples, because that's like a prostitute. I mean,
like for instance, he's eating a meal in a Pharisee's house, and then a woman prostitute comes in, pours, perfume on his feet, and then wipes it with his hair, like
her hair. Yeah.
Her hair. That's that's
It'll make you
pretty strange. It'd be uncomfortable, if not for any other reason than it's going so much against what is socially normal.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it was very uncomfortable for his disciples. I'm not sure how Jesus felt, because obviously Jesus is God. But for his disciples to be like, this is a repulsive person. I mean, unlikely.
Well, the Pharisees were like, well, if he knew what kind of woman this was, he would not be letting her touch him.
Yeah.
Like, that was the idea that they had, and probably his disciples had a similar idea. It's like, what is he doing? Like, he should not be letting this woman touch him. But his idea was very different. It was, let her alone,
Mm-hmm. And if he has the same, I mean, he might have been thinking, like, what we're saying is, he might have been thinking, like, well, this is a person that's sinned, but all have sinned.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, you would let somebody, if you would let anybody do it, then why not this person?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of the reason that the Christians are so attacked on this is because we sometimes don't see it this way. We see, I mean, yes, all have sinned, but homosexuality.
Well, it's a very big thing and not just on this issue, but Christians to vehemently disagree with people who believe other than them, especially on what would we consider bigger issues, like even, and this is beyond just religious issues, like people from a different political party. Like, I know plenty of Christians even who, if someone is the other major party from them, they instantly, that removes any possibility of them having a serious religious spiritual conversation just
Mm-hmm.
because of that one thing.
Yeah.
And so when we put up these barriers and we say, oh, you're different than me because of this, you are in this other group, you are you believe something that I find wrong, and therefore you are a terrible person and I won't listen to you, or I will just try to prove you that you're wrong. And as soon as that happens, you've lost already. Like, you might as well not have the conversation. If you go into it that way, you're not going to accomplish anything good. You're just going to accomplish bad things. Essentially, you're going to cause hurt.
Yeah. Well, I like something you touched on there, because the group mentality thing. It's like, there are groups, but there's only two of them. And sometimes, but the world thinks there's much more than two groups. The world likes to divide us all into groups, and we can be divided by groups and disassociate with other groups,
Mm-hmm.
But from our eyes, there should only be two groups: Christians and non-Christians. And we should treat Christians the same, and we should treat non-Christians the same.
Mm-hmm.
And if not, those who claim to be Christians are denying God, then I guess we treat them like non-Christians.
Essentially.
And so like a lot of Christians probably fall under this thing where they would treat a non-Christian friend who was like them in many ways differently than a non-Christian friend who wasn't like them, or a non-Christian person who wasn't like them. Right.
And so it's not at all based on really what they believe. It's just, this person is like me and therefore I'm comfortable with them by default.
Yeah.
It's not like, Well, it's like the verses when Jesus is talking about like what credit is to you if you love people who love you.
Yeah.
Like even sinners do that. That's just natural to love people who love you. But what he was calling for is to love the people you consider your enemies, to love the people who are not so nice to you.
Yeah.
If you can do that, or if you can bear up under sufferings and suffer for Christ, is what he was saying, then that will count as a reward. But if you suffer for doing I'm confusing two verses here now. Point being, though, and this has been kind of a gradual area of growth for me, is we have to detach ourselves from groups as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like as much every group that you consider yourself firmly a part of and that you identify with. I mean, it's not really bad to be part of groups, but if you firmly identify with them and you think that that's the best group, for every time that is, you're just creating more barriers. Mm-hmm. So if you are, adamantly, one political party, you are this specific denomination of church, you are, this certain type of, and you can just make a list of all these potential groups that you can be in.
Yeah.
You're straight. The more groups you add, the more barriers you put up to legitimately being able to establish relationships with other people. And besides that, why put so much importance into these invisible group lines,
Yeah.
Like I'd say treat someone the same regardless. Like you mentioned, the only two real major barriers as far as the Bible is concerned is there's Christians and non-Christians, and really overall we treat people pretty much the same even between those. There's just a kind of a few special cases, I would say, for Christians.
There should be different purposes for those. Like we should have different, for our relationships with non-Christians should be for a different purpose than our relationships with Christians.
Right.
That's why I think that it is important to identify those groups.
Mm-hmm.
For that reason, because we have different strategies when interacting with these people.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I mean, why do we need groups besides that?
Why closely identify with a group besides that is groups serve a purpose. They make it very much easier for our mind to process the world, to have groups and to have stereotypes. The problem is once we start applying moral value to a worldly or non-spiritual group. Mm-hmm. So once we start saying, I'm this party and this party is more Christian than the other or something like that, or this is the best denomination of Christian church or something like this. Once you start saying that kind of thing, then you're applying moral value to something that is not in the Bible anywhere, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's very dangerous. And you can do the same thing with kind of in reverse, where you instead of saying this is the best of something, like this is the worst, like this political party is like terrible, they're all horribly sinful people, or this talking about homosexuality, this LGBTQ people, they're terrible. Like, I'm not saying that, don't take that out of context. Once you start doing that and applying moral values, negative or positive, to a group, you're crossing a bad line, and you should just be treating people with love.
Mm-hmm.
And even a worse example would be to apply it to like skin color or something. Is obviously skin color is not a moral issue at all. Like there is no moral value in skin color or hair color or anything. Like it's a physical thing that nobody can decide, so they really don't even mention it. But when you get right down to it, so you shouldn't be having these groups. You should love. We are called to love people. That does not mean you have to agree with them, but you should love them. You should still show them respect. They are still people.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard a few too many people who have put so much moral value into certain groups that they're in, that they have even said terrible things like, oh, I wish, this other group of people just didn't exist, or
Mm-hmm.
they should just get shot or something. Just
Yeah.
horrible things, even coming from Christians. And
Yeah.
I look at it very sadly because they've applied so much importance to essentially a man-made category or grouping.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work. It's not good.
Yeah. And so, okay, well, for homosexuality, for example, I think there's two extremes of the views you can have on it. And the one extreme is like we talked about before, somebody who thinks that homosexuality is a sin that's worse than other sins.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very dangerous because it leads us into disassociating with them just because of that sin. Well, we still associate with other non-Christians because they don't have that sin.
Mm-hmm.
They have some other sins, whatever. It doesn't. But the comes down to is that we disassociate with them not because they're sinning, is because we disassociate with them because we're uncomfortable, or we're appalled by their lifestyle.
Right.
But
So that's one extreme.
So that's one extreme. And the other extreme is those who say it's not only is it good, it's acceptable within the church.
Mm-hmm. Which
It's against the Bible.
I guess we're not going to totally debate it, but you have to either ignore or greatly twist the Bible in order to arrive at the conclusion that it's a-okay. Essentially.
And so the thing is, we seem to think we have to either accept it or rebuke it, but we don't treat other sins that way.
No, we don't.
A lot of other sins that are in the world, like say lying, we don't see as like we don't have to like. It's not like there's a big divide in the church of people that say lying is good and people that say lying is horrible. We don't see it.
Most of them would just say it's bad.
Yeah, we don't see it that way. It's like, why do we see this way? We can not be aggressive against people to do this, and also, so we can not be aggressive people to do this, and also at the same time not accept it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm getting into kind of another claim is, so here's a claim people have about Christians is that Christians are intolerant and bigoted and unloving, essentially. And here's the difference is you can disagree with a group of people and still get along fine. Mm-hmm. Now that is a strange thought to some people, but you can disagree with a certain belief or think, okay, that's, I don't believe that. I think it's wrong, but you can still get along just fine with people who do believe that. And I think the real issue is, which is why people think or claim that Christians are intolerant, is when we both disagree with it and essentially disassociate and shun those people because of it and treat them as subhuman in some cases. Mm-hmm. And that's not okay. It's not okay to go so far as to actually be intolerant in a way. But at the same time, you're not really tolerating it.
You're just working around it.
Yeah, there's kind of a fine line.
Well, here's what it comes back to: is if it's not in the church, then what basis do we have to judge them on? No matter what they're doing, no matter what views they hold, if they're not professing Christ, then what moral framework do we have to judge to assume judgment on them, right? Mm-hmm. It's only if they profess Christ that we can should actually take offense at a sin that they might be doing.
Mm-hmm. And at which case we'd actually, either really rebuke them or.
Well, I mean, maybe it's
remove them from the church.
It might be as simple as trying to help them through it. It depends how firmly they hold it. I mean,
right.
Depends what it is. It could be something you can work through it with them, mm-hmm. Or it could be something they hold so strongly that they end up leaving to the church because of it. But and so it's what it comes back to is if somebody's not in the church, then why should we care what they believe? It doesn't matter because they already don't deny that God is real. And that's what really matters in the end.
Well, we should care, but we shouldn't get in their face about it.
I mean,
It's not our job to like sit
we-
on the street corner and say, "Oh, you're a terrible sinner," and you're a terrible. It's not our job to.
we should care about their soul, not what
Right.
they believe. And if they decide to follow God, then hopefully they reevaluate their beliefs.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of one little difference between treating Christians and non-Christians that's kind of confusing, I think, to some people, is just the difference, and I think a lot of people don't see a difference there, and so their goal is, okay, this is a sin, and I'm just going to go and blatantly tell non-Christians like, oh, you're sinning, you have to change right now, and just kind of this fire and brimstone kind of mentality. But when that's the first thing you approach someone with, it doesn't really work.
Yeah.
That can't be, because they're just gonna see you as
I mean, that you're dividing yourself. You're putting barriers out before you even have a relationship,
right.
and that's not helpful in any way.
Oh, okay. So I think let's get into kind of going through this list of claims here. I think so. I already mentioned there's a decent number of people now, especially when it relates to issues like homosexuality, that claim that Christians are intolerant and bigoted. Now, I think something that's important to mention on this, which I think applies to a lot of these things, is it's kind of a tricky thing, because if people are genuinely following Christ's example, I don't really think they're going to be I don't think they're going to be intolerant or genuinely which here I guess we have to get into definitions, like what does it mean to be intolerant? But I don't think someone who is really following Christ's example is going to be argumentative and mean-spirited about it, or shun someone who's non-Christian because of a difference in belief. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, Well, yeah. Well, let's look at some examples. So Jesus was argumentative with, or like, not argumentative. Let's see. There were times that he was confrontational about beliefs, but to who? That's the key.
Generally to Jewish leaders.
Jewish leaders. So he was confrontational with people about beliefs when they had the same basis, like the same. They both were arguing from the perspective of somebody who follows the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he was willing to confront people when they were twisting, or when
they were twisting the scriptures, or they were teaching their own traditions.
Yeah, they claimed to have the same values as him, but they were trying to interpret it differently. But so that's I think that comes back to, like, yes, you have to be confrontational with people who believe this, who claim to believe the same as you, or who claim to follow God but choose to go a different route.
Mm-hmm.
But not to those who don't claim to follow God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Jesus wasn't trying to convince the Gentiles why the law was right. Because that wasn't what he was doing.
No, it wasn't.
That would be pointless, because the Gentiles like, well, I don't care what the laws says anyways.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the point I was trying to make is, I think the people who genuinely are intolerant and bigoted, they're not really following Christ's example totally. Like the people who actually would just shun a homosexual, for instance, or to treat them subhuman. Do you see what I'm kind of getting at?
Yeah.
And really, intolerant is such a hard word to mess with, because like you have to define it and everything, and you can tolerate something, but it's just difficult. Another thing is, when you call someone intolerant and you kind of exclude them because of that, You're being intolerant yourself, and so it's really kind of a muddy issue.
Yeah.
And a similar claim is people would say Christians are unloving. You brought this up earlier. How can Christians love everyone and yet say that it's wrong to be a homosexual?
Well, I think it's the same way we can love any non-Christian.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole thing, is we have to rethink this and think about it differently. It's like we can love other non-Christians but they still sin.
Mm-hmm. So just because we get along with them doesn't mean we agree with them.
Yeah.
But just because we disagree with them doesn't mean that we don't get along with them. It's kind of both ways.
Because at the core, you should have different values in every non-Christian, right?
Mm-hmm. And even in some Christians.
And so we choose, if we're like completely getting along with a non-Christian, we have to accept the fact that there's different values, and if we don't accept that fact, then maybe we're ignoring our values.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to realize, every time we interact with a non-Christian, we have to realize that don't have the same goal here on earth. We have different values at the core.
Mm-hmm.
We may appear to be very similar people. We may have the same moral philosophies as far as on different issues, but at the core we have different purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same. And so what really matters is different. Well, some less important things may be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's with every non-Christian, is what really matters is the different thing. Well, it doesn't matter as much. It doesn't matter if the symptomatic or the symptoms of the problem are different. So if
the individual cases of a person being a sinner is not is not as important as the fact that they are a sinner.
Yeah.
And that they have not
chosen to be redeemed.
Chosen to follow Christ.
Yeah. So that the personal ways that they're doing something wrong is not as important as the fact that they are fallen away from God.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to remember that more. And look at the core of the issue.
And as far as Christians being unloving, again, it's difficult because I would say a Christian who is genuinely following Christ and his example and what the Scripture says is going to be loving. And I think that's an issue where a lot of Christians here in America have kind of slipped up on, is that we probably aren't as loving as we should be towards others or even among ourselves. We don't have the kind of, awe-inspiring love that Jesus showed and that is talked about in some of the epistles.
Yeah. Though, just to clarify that, I think a lot of the times when Jesus is talking about loving others, he's talking about amongst the church, right?
He is a lot of times. But I think it... I think it applies beyond that as well, but there is kind of a special love for fellow brothers and sisters of Christ.
Yeah. I think we need to understand that we shouldn't have the same level of... I don't know what the correct word for... There's different types of love for Christians and non-Christians, I feel like.
Yeah.
I feel like the Bible does.
There's definitely a difference where we are... it does speak on us having kind of almost, I would describe it as like supernatural love for fellow Christians.
Brotherly love is another way to describe it.
Brotherly love, yeah. Because the book of 1 John mentions that, and just also the Gospel of John, he writes that that our love for one another would essentially demonstrate Christ's love and would show other people who Christ is, really. Mm-hmm. And so it was such a powerful kind of love that it would show and prove that we were united and that Christ was more than just a man, essentially.
Yeah.
And I think we a lot of times, I think we've failed, especially here in America, at actually achieving that kind of love for one another within the church. But I think a lot of times we also kind of fail on having the amount of love we should have for people outside the church. We either generally don't care about them, or we just are,
Don't put in enough effort.
don't put enough effort, or we flat out are mean to them in some cases.
Yeah. Which is a problem.
Which is a problem. Definitely.
Especially being mean to them outright.
If a Christian is genuinely unloving, then that person is, in that instance, is not following Christ. They are breaking away from what it should be. So you want to read the next claim that people have about Christians?
Oh yeah, Christians think that they are better than everyone else.
I've heard this a few times. How about you?
It's very a common phrase, or a very common thought.
They think they're so high and mighty, or
yeah.
Always taking the moral high ground might be a way to, or another way to word it might be Christians are judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of looking down their nose at everybody.
I think there's reasons that people feel this way.
It's because sometimes we are.
Yeah.
Quite simply.
And so what were you going to say?
No, you go ahead.
And so, like, to get straight to the point, the reason we are not better than everyone else, but we have made a decision that people haven't made.
Yeah. So we're different than everyone else.
We're different than everyone else. We have. It comes back to we're not. It's not by our own actions that we are saved. It's by God's grace.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have made a different decision that other people have, but doesn't make us better than them. It just makes us redeemed.
Mm-hmm. And I think one way I heard it put, which I really like, is Christians don't think they're better than everyone else. They don't think that they are perfect, but rather they realize that they are not perfect and that they are flawed.
Exactly.
So I don't attend church because I think I'm perfect. If I thought I was perfect, I would not be here.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a key to someone who is genuinely following Christ should not be coming at anyone from a
high ground.
From the high ground,
the
moral high ground, or thinking that they are perfect or are superior or have, if that's what they're doing, then they have missed a pretty fundamental teaching, which is humility, essentially.
The truth.
The truth. The very fact is, someone who is genuinely following Christ is doing it because they realize that they have sinned and that they have fallen short of the glory of God and that they need His grace, and that without it, then they do not have hope.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of similar with the early ones. There's an important distinction between, yes, there are definitely some Christians, or people who describe themselves as Christians who definitely who do think they're better than everyone else and are very judgmental, and they think that they have attained the moral high ground and that they are pretty much set. And then they do judge other people, who, either other Christians or just people out in the world, and see them as lesser than themselves. And that is a sad fact.
Yeah.
But we have to be very clear here and say that is not in line with what the Bible teaches. Mm-hmm. If they are doing that, they are not acting in the best interests or in the will of Christ. They are doing their own thing, essentially.
Yeah. It's kind of like somebody who's judgmental is kind of like somebody who has been who's inherited a lot of money and then brags about how hard he's worked for all his money, or something like that.
Yeah. Or
he's been given this great gift, and he keeps bragging about how I don't know, how rich,
how hard he worked for something that he didn't work for.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the good thing that we do have is something we got for free.
Mm-hmm.
And
the Bible is pretty clear on what happens if you exalt yourself. Is that you're very clearly humbled, and that we should be humble from the get-go.
Yeah.
And another thing it's clear on is the more strictly you judge other people, and the higher standards you have for other people, the more strictly you will be judged, and the higher standards God is going to apply to you.
Mm-hmm.
That's also multiple times taught throughout the New Testament.
Yeah. And it's always fun to think how it's interesting to think about is that somebody who's a Christian could have way more sins in their past, even like less knowledge of the Bible, less knowledge of God than somebody who's not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who's not a Christian could be a complete, have the Bible memorized, have a sinless life, and all that, and still be not in line for heaven, and somebody who's had many sins.
Well, when you say sinless life, you don't really mean.
Well, yeah,
sinless
but close to sinless life. Yeah, you know what I mean.
What would we consider like a good person?
A good person. A very good person. Yeah. And so you have to remember that because it's not about what we've done or what we know or how
perfect we are.
Yeah, it's not about that at all. Not even one iota.
And a Christian who acts that way is not being very Christian-like. He's not being very Christ-like.
Yeah.
Okay. Another claim is that Christianity has caused many wars and conflicts throughout history, and that the world would be more peaceful and just better off without it. In fact, just religion in general, it'd be better. The world would be better off without it.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts?
And I think the main example they're probably talking about is the Crusades.
Crusades, and then 100 Years' War and a whole bunch of other wars in Europe.
Okay, well, and I think basically everybody who was just involved in those wars wasn't following Christ in doing that.
Right. So you've jumped right to the point and is saying that if someone is starting a war and claiming that it is for Christ, then they're probably they probably went off the track somewhere. Yeah,
that's my opinion on it. It's pretty straight and simple. I don't see how. I don't think you can make a claim that you can, any war was inspired, or any war, or any physical fighting, is for God. Really, I don't. Well, let me try to redefine. I don't think you can I don't think God would want us to start a war, for Him.
Right.
So it's because people thought. Well, Jesus' goal wasn't to start a war when He came. It was to save the people's eternal souls, not their physical bodies.
Right.
And I think that's the example we have, is that Jesus' goal was not to become a king on this earth. His goal was not to become a king so He could fix the earth. It was become a king of an eternal home. Mm-hmm. And we would...
If you were to... If a disinterested third party were to read through the Bible... especially the New Testament, and they would not come to the conclusion that the Bible mandated or encouraged violence or war.
Yeah.
You would not come to that conclusion. Now, you could maybe look in the Old Testament and see all the things that God commanded the Israelites to do, for instance, and be like, man, God is such a violent God. Why is He doing all this? But that's a different scenario, and
I think it is very important to clarify. I think it is very important that we do live by the New Testament.
Yeah.
If we lived by the Old Testament, we could get away with a lot of stuff, but we don't live by the Old Testament.
Right.
The Old Testament is history. The New Testament is our example.
Well, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of commandments that are more kind of clerical and have to do with living of life, and they're not repeated in the New Testament. So,
and in fact, there's verses in the New Testament. It's like these things have passed away. Right. This is a new law, a new covenant. And so, yeah.
So essentially, on this one, we kind of come to the same answer, which is no war is really genuinely started or fought because of what the Bible teaches, or
Yeah.
because of Christianity, because of genuine Christianity. I feel like we always have to make this kind of side note, because just because someone says they are a Christian does not necessarily mean they are Christian.
Yeah.
And if we look at, like, for instance, the Crusades, that was the Catholic Church. I would argue that that's kind of a separate thing from Christianity. Maybe that's a pot of worms, but
It's a topic for another day.
maybe so.
It's a bit, yeah.
But so people make this claim and they think, oh, the world would be so much better off without religion, and especially without Christianity. But I think it's kind of a little bit ignorant to just say that, because you look at the past century and a half and think of all the wars and atrocities that were committed. So like World War I and II, Hitler's, massacre of Jews, Stalin's, essentially mass murder of his own citizens, and similar examples. Those had nothing to do with religion or with Christianity.
Yeah. Well, I think the Nazis did profess, or the Nazis was somewhat religious, but
But their motives for doing it were purely selfish, and I think that's what it comes down to. Is pretty I mean, so you can't look in the New Testament and find evidence for we should start wars. You just can't do it.
Yeah.
You might be able to do that in some other religions.
Probably, but
if you cherry pick certain things in the Quran and Islam, for instance, you could come to that conclusion. But you could also cherry pick other things and come to the conclusion that it's totally a religion of peace. So it I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think since our basis is of peace, then I don't think it's not the Bible's fault or Jesus' teaching's fault that caused the Crusades. It was because of men's corruption.
Right.
So it was not the teachings of Jesus that caused the pain on the earth. It was the fallen nature of this world.
Right.
Just like any other pain that's been caused by the sin of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So
we come to kind of the same answer, is that so-called Christians who do these things, they're not really following Christ in doing them, which is, maybe it sounds a little bit shifty to just say, oh, all of these problems, all these claims leveled against Christianity, well, that's not real Christians. It's maybe a little shady, but it's kind of the truth. The truth is
we're judged by our actions. So if our actions are not following in line with Christ's teachings, then we're not.
Right.
You can't blame Christ for that.
But the truth is that even Christians are largely, we've got our problems. We're not perfect, like we've already mentioned.
Yeah.
And sometimes we go against what we say we believe in, which, going to the next claim, is that Christians are hypocritical. And
it's true.
It's, again, oftentimes it's true, which is sad. It shouldn't be the way things are, but it is true. Everyone has their moment. Some people have a lot more of them than others.
I mean, any time that we try to impose a belief on somebody that we don't follow ourselves, we're being hypocrites.
Mm-hmm. And I think this especially comes, like earlier we were talking about homosexuality and marriage and things, is that it's hypocritical for some preachers to say homosexuality is wrong because the biblical model was one man and one woman, and yet they will allow multiple marriages and things like that.
Yeah.
It's there's certain things where it's hypocritical, and we're really just shooting ourselves in the foot if we teach that way, because we're showing the whole world that we're kind of a farce.
We're cherry picking what we think is bad.
Right. And we're ultimately we're ultimately living for ourselves and just kind of fitting Christianity along with it, which is a very bad thing.
And I think this last claim is like what hits the hardest, for me anyway, is the claim that Christians are divided, which is very true.
Which is, again, it's very true. If you look even within a single congregation, you'll probably find some issues that people are not willing to budge on. They're divided over it. And then you can also zoom out and say, well, look how many denominations there are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really a pretty sad thing, because the model we were given is that we were supposed to have unity and to be one. Why are we so divided?
Yeah, and I think what it comes down to is that some people along the way are not always following Christ all the time.
Mm.
And then it causes divisions where we decide to follow and where we decide to disobey.
And we insert our own traditions and things, and we perhaps we follow a certain leader rather than we begin following Christ. Or no, we begin following a leader or a prominent figure rather than Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of attaching directly to what the Bible says, we're attaching to,
this variation of
Luther or Calvin or name other major denominations. And so instead of being attached to Christ, we're attached to not Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what it comes down to is not if we have priorities that are slightly above Christ, whether they be another man's teaching, a tradition, or anything, then we become divided on those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, we've had more and more traditions and teachings and people, leaders.
And then it eventually gets to the point where we start ascribing moral value to one group and then saying that it's the best. And then Christ legitimately becomes divided.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, you'd think this wouldn't happen because Paul wrote about it in Corinthians. He mentioned people in the church there were following certain leaders and saying, I am of Paul or I am of Apollos. You'd think we wouldn't do it, but we do. We say, I am of the Christian church or the Church of Christ, or I am of the Baptist church, or I am of Methodist. We say these things, and that's how we describe ourselves. We don't describe ourselves as Christians so much anymore.
Yeah.
We've become members of a group rather than members of Christ's kingdom.
Yeah. And that's basically shows direct disobedience to to Christ's will.
Right. Not only are we not being unified, we're kind of following something else, putting it a little bit above him.
Mm-hmm. And so that is a point where the world is I guess kind of right, because like, yes, we are divided. It is a huge issue.
And so speaking personally, so I was raised. My dad was a preacher. Predominantly, we was raised in the Church of Christ, though also Christian churches from time to now and again. And so growing up in that environment, I was essentially taught that because of the beliefs that the Church of Christ has, for instance, it is pretty much, what I was taught was it was the best. Mm-hmm. Essentially, it was the best because its beliefs most clearly and most clearly line up with the Bible. And so then I would be taught things about other denominations like the Baptists or something, and say like, oh, well, they don't believe the same thing about salvation. They don't believe that baptism is necessary. So growing up, I was essentially told by my dad mostly, and just my family and the people I associated with, that other denominations were, they had these problems with them, these flaws, right? And so I grew up essentially aligning myself and identifying myself with the Church of Christ. That was the best, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I identified as that, and I didn't really necessarily even see other people as Christians, or as people from other denominations as Christians, because they had some fundamental flaw in their beliefs, and therefore they weren't Christians, which is maybe true of some of them, but I just applied it to all of them, like across the board. And so it wasn't until college when I really actually interacted with people from other denominations a lot, which, I just kind of grew up in a bubble, right?
Yeah.
A lot of us do. So when I started going to Christian college groups and things, I started associating with a lot of people from other denominations, a lot of Baptists and things, a lot of people who had different beliefs. And for the first time, I was actually able to see, well, first of all, I was able to interact and see what those people actually believed, right?
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see because, I met some people who were genuinely passionate and on fire about Christ in a way that I hadn't actually seen so much in the Church of Christ growing up. And that kind of put a pause to me. I had to pause and think about that. It's like, why is that the case? And so I guess the point of what I'm saying here is we can't get into the group think and the group mentality and exclude entire groups. Because while they may have certain beliefs that are different, a lot of them are also just wanting to follow Christ as much as they can, and they may not have gotten it all right. We haven't gotten it all right either.
Yeah.
And so the thought came to me is like, well, why? I see these other people who have quite a lot of passion for following Christ, more so than I did at the time, and I just had to ask myself, like, well, why do they have something that I don't and that I don't see in the Church of Christ? Like, at the very least, I have to, think about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, why aren't we that way? And it's just something to think about, I guess. Yeah.
It's a really tricky conversation. It's almost like you don't really want to go into it just because it's
well, because
the whole thing is like, but I guess at the end of the day, we don't judge people, or we're not the ones that make the final judgment.
mm-hmm.
Our goal is to try to spread the truth as much as we can,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever God decides is His decision.
Right.
Because that's the comforting factor.
Right. And so we're not here to judge. And I think it's not good for us to get into groupthink so much that we exclude entire groups of other people. Some of them, they maybe believe slightly different on, a fairly insignificant issue.
Like the instrument.
Well, yeah, so within the Church of Christ, some believe you can use an instrument in church and some believe you can't, believe it's a horrible sin.
Yeah.
And people exclude other congregations, entire other groups of people for that. Some of them will even go so far as to say you're going to hell if you use an instrument. And that's an issue that's within one denomination, right? That's not even talking about two denominations.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, they believe the same, but then there's that one thing which the Bible doesn't say too much on. And so the way the Bible talks about us as Christians, the way we should treat other Christians, is it doesn't include this level of exclusion as we so often see. That's what I'm trying to say, I guess.
Yeah.
We're so divided on so many lines, and I think a lot of it is because of the barriers we put up.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question is, how do we become undivided? And that's a very difficult question.
But what it comes down to is if we all seek the truth with our open, with a full heart, and put aside all preconceived notions and opinions, then we would become undivided. But that's a very hard thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
We had to put aside all the things we've been taught, every opinion we have, and just look at one thing, which is the will of Christ. We would come together, but that would be super hard.
It'd be difficult, but that's like how, that's how revivals essentially what's happened. So we think back to like restoration. What the Restoration movement, is that the right one I'm thinking about? That happened in America.
I think so. Yeah.
Is that involved a lot of groups of people who just decided they were going to put aside their beliefs and look at the Bible alone. And so that's what actually brought rise to several, like the Church of Christ and things like that, actually came from, or predominantly came from, a revival, essentially, where people did that. But I think the first thing that has to happen in order for us to do that is to disassociate ourselves from a denomination, essentially, for a while, the moment we're doing that. And that can happen in a small group Bible study, for instance.
Yeah.
If you think about it. So you get together, you don't necessarily invite people just from your church. You just invite some other Christians, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And you just make it a group to find the truth. You're seeking the truth. It's one potential way. Finding unity is such a hard issue, though.
Yeah, and it starts with humility, I feel like. It starts there.
A lot of things start there.
Yeah, so it's a big topic, and it has a sad thing that's happened, and
so maybe for all of these through all these claims, and this is just a list of just like 6, the Christians being divided is maybe the most true, I would say.
It's the most true and the most sad.
And the most sad. What else can you say about it? It's a sad thing that there are so many denominations, that even within a single denomination there can be divisions and infighting, and we don't have the level of unity and love for each other that I think we should.
Yeah.
And I think it's up to all of us to do some serious soul searching to figure out why.
Yeah. If we all it's humility and love is what will help us get through this. So I guess we can go on to a couple more questions. We've already went through the first one,
And kind of the third one.
and the second one, kind of. And okay, so we've talked about. Actually, let's do the fifth one.
Go for it.
So we talked about how Christians are sometimes viewed as intolerant or bigoted.
Mm-hmm.
And while that may or may not be true, or may be true to a certain degree, should we care how the world views us?
Yes and no.
I think, yeah, we need to be careful that we don't care too much. I mean, I don't know. On a big scale, no, because the world is not judging us. The world is not our judge. The world is a sinful place. We shouldn't be striving after to please them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I guess on another side of it, though, if we do not care, we can't be putting up unnecessary walls. So if we we can't be putting walls up.
Putting barriers that prevent us from doing anything. Oops.
Yeah. So I guess that's the yes and no, where the yes and no comes from.
Yeah, so I would say yes and no, but predominantly no.
Yeah.
Is that as a whole, we should not put a lot of stock into what the world thinks about us. That I think there are a few passages that do talk about, we are ambassadors to the world, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to care about how we act in our conduct and make sure it is in line with Christ, because if we slip up, then other people will see us and they will rightly see us as hypocrites, or as being unloving, or as being divided, or as all these kind of things. So we do have to be careful in one respect, in that we are actually doing what we're saying and that we're actually following Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not doing that so that the world doesn't see us as hypocrites. We're doing that because we should be following Christ.
Yeah.
Primarily I say no because, like you said, we cannot be up to the world's standards. We cannot
achieve that, because that would be going against God's standards.
Right. At that point, if we care more about that than God's standards, then we are just living for the world, really.
Yeah.
So as a whole, no. And so we have to be able to have the kind of courage that is required for standing up against against sin and standing up for what the Bible teaches. And we need to do that across the board, not hypocritically. We need to do that on all issues. We can't
cherry pick.
we can't say, okay, you know what, this issue is not so bad, or, oh, well, what this passage said was just because of the culture of the time, and it's changed now. We can't do that with a few things, because as soon as we do, then we've become kind of hypocritical and we've cherry-picked. And so we have to, as a whole, not care what the world thinks.
Yeah. And that, yeah, like you said, it takes courage, because, I mean, some of the things, like, we could be called intolerant or bigoted, and if we're being called bigoted for the wrong reason, then we should look at that. But for the most part, then we just have to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's...
And continue in love.
Yeah.
As long as we're not going against what Christ teaches, we shouldn't care all that much.
Yeah, we have to learn to accept the fact that we'll be hated by the world. That's a promise, actually, to us.
And I think there are some things, though, where it is good to kind of go along with the flow of what the world thinks is normal or acceptable. So, like, for instance, fashion. Not totally, but to some extent, if we were to just continue wearing 200-year-old fashion or something, clothes, for whatever reason, maybe because we thought it was the most modest or something, then we instantly put up this kind of weird barrier.
Yeah.
With everyone else.
Well, and yeah, you're right. And it comes back to, it's like, this is not in the Bible, so.
Right. So it doesn't matter. So let's try not to make a bunch of extra commands, and let's just, so for things that aren't in the Bible that don't matter, just kind of go with the flow a little bit, you know?
Yeah.
So, like, and that can definitely be gone. You can definitely go too far on that. But I think there was a quote by, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, where it was something along the lines of, in matters of principle, stand firm like a rock. In matters of taste, flow with the stream. Something along those lines. Which it's Thomas Jefferson. It's not Bible, but the idea is, for the things that truly matter, for what Christ teaches, we have to remain firm. We have to say, no, I don't care what the world says.
Yeah.
But for some things, we can say, okay, we'll just go along with it, because it'll make things a lot easier.
Yeah. We don't need to put up unnecessary barriers.
Yeah.
Whether it be weird or just why. Yeah. There's no reason to put up unnecessary barriers. I think the fourth question we might need to skip, because that'd probably be a whole topic of its own.
Yeah, so the fourth question is, how should we treat Christians who are living in sin, which the Bible has some specific guidelines for what we would maybe now refer to as excommunication, which is a word that's kind of made up. It's not in the Bible, but the idea of, okay, how do you gently, lovingly, but also firmly confront a fellow Christian about their sin? And there's a lot to that. That's probably good for its own podcast, maybe. Yeah,
that's actually, come to think of it, it's pretty much separate from the rest of the podcast, so we don't need to get into that right now. Anyway, so that was a good podcast episode.
So it wasn't very organized, but we went over like several claims and questions. I would say the overall kind of theme to what we've talked about is
apologetics. No.
Not really apologetics. Is dealing with non-Christians, really.
Yeah.
I think. And with the things they say about us, and with also with how we should respond to them, and how we should behave around them, essentially, to them.
Evaluate what they say about us.
And so that goes across a lot of things, and there are tons of other claims that we could maybe bring up. It's interesting just to look up like a list of what is wrong with Christianity, and there's a lot of things, and some things are fair, and then some things are also just kind of, where do they come from with that? Like, they're a little twisted sometimes, but
yeah.
Yeah, so it's always good to be asking yourself questions and to be evaluating how the world sees you and how the world sees Christianity. We had a video recently, or Jonathan did a video on, are we really different than the world, right? With asking the primary question is, are we different? Because we kind of should be, right? So evaluating ourselves is definitely good.
Yeah.
And also knowing what people think of you is good. I mean, even Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say that I am, right? He was curious to know what the world thought of him. And he got a whole bunch of answers. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
So, if you liked the episode, I don't know. I don't know what to say.
You can watch it.
Wait, you've already watched it.
Hopefully. I mean, if you want to like the video, you can, but we're not going to be that type of people.
We're not going to be.
We're not going to do that to you. We're not going to pressure you.
So this has been the 11th podcast. We've had a really awkward ending here. My name is Thomas, and this is my friend Johan.
Johan.
Good night, and be salty.